Ready to go? Thanks very much for joining me. Today, I announce Labor's plan to create jobs, cut power bills, boost renewables and reduce emissions. Labor's Powering Australia plan is fully costed, and we have released the modelling today by Reputex. This is the most comprehensive modelling ever done for any policy by any opposition in Australia's history since Federation. Our plan will create 604,000 extra jobs by 2030. 5 out of every 6 of these will be in regional Australia. It will unlock $52 billion of private sector investment in Australian industries. It will see electricity prices fall from the current level by $275 for households by 2025, at the end of our first term, if we're successful. Over the forward estimates, the costs to the budget will be $683 million. Australian business is leading. It's time that the Australian government caught up. That's why our plan to create jobs, cut power bills, boost renewables and reduce emissions is the right plan for Australia. It has key elements to it, some of which we've announced previously, but today we put it all together in a comprehensive plan to take Australia forward. To modernise the electricity grid with the Rewiring the Nation plan. It's time it was brought into the 21st century. Community batteries for shared storage. Solar banks for households that can't install rooftop panels. We want to reduce Australian Public Service's own emissions to net zero by 2030. It's time that government lead, and a Labor government would do just that. We would exclude the Australian Defence Force, the AFP, Border Force and security agencies from this. For facilities that are already covered by the government's safeguard mechanism, we'll adopt the Business Council's recommendation, to quote them, the baselines be reduced predictably and gradually over time. And we'll do so in a way that's consistent with reaching net zero emissions by 2050. We will also protect the competitiveness of emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries by ensuring that they will not face a greater constraint than any of their competitors. We'll establish a Powering the Regions Fund from the existing Emissions Reduction Fund and Climate Solutions Fund. But in addition to that, we'll allocate up to $3 billion of the National Reconstruction Fund for industries to adapt and new industries to grow in regions, including in areas like green metals, hydrogen electrolysers and agricultural methane reduction. We'll remove taxes from cheaper electric vehicles. We'll develop a national electric vehicle strategy, including the necessary infrastructure rollouts. We want Australians to benefit in terms of jobs, and that's why we'll create new energy apprenticeships to make sure that the work can be done. What we've done here, and we're announcing today, is good policy consistent with net zero by 2050. What we didn't do was adopt a target and then work back. What we did was work through what are the good policy mechanisms that will see a growth in jobs, a reduction in emissions, a growth in renewables and a reduction in power prices for households and business, and then see where that came up through the modelling. And the comprehensive plan, the modelling shows, will result in a 43% reduction by 2030 on 2005 levels. It's consistent as well with the COP26 statement, calling for an updated target of those countries that didn't do that at the Glasgow conference, and for that to happen by 2022. Now, I note that the federal government, the Australian government, signed up to that communique, but then put out a media release just afterwards saying we didn't really mean it and we won't change anything because Barnaby Joyce won't let us. This government has had over 20 attempts at an energy policy without landing one. This policy is the one Labor will take to the election and the one policy we will implement in government. In Glasgow, Scott Morrison gave an empty speech to an empty room with empty promises and no plan. This is a government that's frozen in time while the world warms around it. I expect the government to lie about this policy. There's a pattern of behaviour with this Prime Minister. He's made public comment on it without seeing it, let alone looking at the modelling. We have made sure that we have got this right over a period of time. We've released it when I said we would, after Glasgow and when we could have certainty going forward. Business wants certainty. That's why the Business Council, the Australian Industry Group and other business organisations have all been crying out for it. Major businesses and peak organisations all called for net zero by 2050 well before this government did. And this government, of course, just really have a vibe rather than a policy or a plan. This plan will ensure that no business and no worker is left behind. It ensures that Australia can take our place, which we should, as a renewable energy superpower for the world. One where high-value manufacturing and jobs are created, powered by cleaner, cheaper power. In conclusion, this plan will create jobs, cut power bills, boost renewables and reduce emissions. It's the right plan for Australia going forward. It's the plan that acknowledges what business wants. It's the plan that acknowledges that the world economy is demanding this, as belatedly senior government ministers have acknowledged. They've acknowledged what Australia needs to do. They just don't have a plan to get there. A future Labor government does, consistent with our optimistic view that Australia can be a better country coming out of the global pandemic, that we should be optimistic about our future, that we should seize the opportunities that are there due to the natural advantages we have, located in the fastest growing region of the world in human history, with the abundant renewable resources as well as other resources that we have in this country. Our greatest resource, of course, is our people. And what this plan does is maximise the potential of those people to get high-paid, good, secure work, and for households and businesses to have much cheaper and cleaner energy.
Thanks, Anthony. Lower power prices, more jobs, lower emissions. That's what the Powering Australia plan that an Albanese Labor government will deliver for Australians. That's what it will do. Lower power prices, more jobs, lower emissions. Over the last 8 years, Australia has been missing out on the jobs opportunity that is the world's climate emergency. Australians are paying more for electricity than they should be because this government keeps missing the opportunities. And because of Scott Morrison and the Liberal Party, our emissions aren't coming down fast enough to protect our planet for future generations. It'll be up to an Albanese Labor government to fix it, and fix it we will. As Anthony said, we are releasing the most comprehensive modelling that any opposition has ever commissioned and released to support a policy. This modelling has been conducted by Reputex, Australia's leading energy economists, commissioned by the federal government, the current federal government, commissioned by many of Australia's biggest companies to advise them. This work has been independently conducted and explains in detail the implications of Labor's policies for the Australian economy and the positive economic benefit that they have. federal government released a fortune cookie when they released their policy, scribbled on the back of a coaster. We, as the alternative government, are releasing a comprehensive plan supported by comprehensive evidence. Anthony ran through the figures, but they're important enough to repeat. 604,000 jobs created. Energy bills, which will be $275 for the average house, lower in 2025 than today, and $378 lower by 2035. 5 out of the 6 jobs created in Australia's regions, the regions that have powered Australia for so long, the Hunter Valley, Central Queensland, the Pilbara, the Latrobe Valley, they will be the same areas that will power Australia into the future. That's why the regions are the big winners under Labor's plan. And the modelling shows that Labor's policy will reduce emissions by 43% by 2030, and Australia's electricity market will be 82% renewable under the policies of an Albanese Labor government. 43% will be Australia's new target, communicated to the COP by the Albanese Labor government. It isn't an ambition, it isn't an aspiration, it is the result of our policies, not wished into being by assumptions that somehow technology will magically appear, the concrete result of policy, and that will be communicated to the COP. It is a target with teeth. And whereas the Morrison government was embarrassed at Glasgow and they embarrassed Australia, we'll be proud of our policies, and an Albanese Labor government will bid to host COP29 in 2024 in Australia, and we will be inviting our Pacific Island friends and neighbours to join us in hosting it if they wish. Also, as Climate Change Minister in Anthony's government, I'll be reporting annually to Parliament on progress in a way similar to the government's reports on Indigenous disadvantage. We want to be held to account for progress. We want the Parliament to be focusing on how well we are doing as a country. And today we're announcing further comprehensive policies, building on our Rewiring the Nation, electric vehicle tax cut, community batteries, new energy apprentices. As Anthony said, the Australian public service will be net zero by 2030. 75% of new vehicle purchases in the Commonwealth fleet will be EVs by 2025. We'll introduce real-world testing of motor vehicles' emissions to give Australians the informed choice they need. They want to reduce their emissions through their transport, and they want real choices and real information, and we'll fund real-world testing. We'll fund 85 solar banks across Australia to open up the renewable energy revolution to those who can't afford solar or who are renters or are in strata where they can't get solar panels. These people deserve the reduced prices that come with having solar energy, and our solar bank policy will complement our community battery policy as well. And then turning to the safeguards mechanism. Now, as you know, the Abbott government told the Australian people they would introduce the safeguards mechanism to ensure that carbon pollution by the biggest emitters wouldn't go up. It isn't working. Emissions have gone up from these facilities by 7% since it was introduced. The Business Council of Australia has said, with an enhanced safeguard mechanism, we can send clear signals to the market, drive investment and deliver more jobs in stronger regions. The Business Council's right. The AIG has called for the same reform. So an Albanese Labor government will ask the Clean Energy Regulator to gradually reduce the emission baselines for entities currently covered by the safeguards mechanism to be consistent with net zero. We will require the Clean Energy Regulator to ensure that any emissions-intensive trade-exposed facility will face a carbon constraint no more onerous than their international competitors. That has been factored into the modelling. That instruction to the Clean Energy Regulator is factored into the emissions reductions we achieve. Now, the Liberals and Nationals will say all sorts of things about the safeguard mechanism. All sorts of scare campaigns will be waged, but the government will have some explaining to do. Why does this Liberal National government think they know more about business than business knows about business? Why does the Morrison government think they know more about business than the Business Council? Why does the Morrison government think they know more about industry than the Australian Industry Group? We want to work with industry. We want to work with business on this massive economic opportunity. We want to be partners with business. Anthony as Prime Minister, me as Climate Change Minister, want to be equal partners with Australia's business in this massive economic transformation. The Morrison government thinks business is wrong. Well, we'll be business's partners. The Morrison government is business's enemy. By rejecting the recommendations of the Business Council and the AIG, Scott Morrison and Angus Taylor are working against the interests of the Australian economy and Australian business. In addition, as Anthony said, we're announcing 2 initiatives to support industry, particularly with a focus on regions, the Powering the Regions Fund and the allocation under the National Reconstruction Fund for decarbonising existing industry in the regions, for development of new energy industries, including green hydrogen, and workforce development and skills development. So 8 years of denial and delay is 8 years too many. 8 years of policy chop and change has to end. It's time for a federal government that understands that the world's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity. The federal government that will understand that will be the Anthony Albanese Labor government.
Mr Albanese, $275 is a big claim to make, and Australians have seen lots of claims in the past for the household benefit from climate policies. So how sure are you that that 275 is robust when you've only got 3 years to deliver it, from 22 to 25? What calculation are you making now about what a household bill is currently, and what is it about this new policy? Is it the grid investment or something else that actually generates that $275 benefit?
Well, I don't think I know. I know because we have done the modelling. The modelling is available. We're releasing it here today. That is the average reduction in power prices from today as a result of the suite of policies which we've announced.
2 things the government's going to say off the bat. One of them, Mr Bowen alluded to. They're going to say that lowering the baseline on the safeguard mechanism is as good as a carbon tax. How do you counter that? And the second is, if 45% reduction at the last election was too much in your words, why isn't 43?
What we've done with our plan is to outline the policies going forward, each of which are positive policies to grow the economy, to grow jobs, to lower energy prices. So we haven't done a figure and then worked backwards. What we've done is outline good policy development, consistent, it must be said, with what overwhelmingly business is calling for. We have consulted the business community. We've consulted the union movement. We've consulted very, very broadly. We've sat down with economists. We have sat down with experts across a range of areas, and you would agree, I would hope, that we've been patient as well to make sure that one of the things that I said was that we would have one announcement this term. We've done that. We're very confident that this is exactly the right policy going forward. It's consistent with getting to net zero by 2050. We know as well that as over a period of time, technology has got better, of course, and renewables have come down in price. The benefit of the shift to clean energy is there for all to see. Business know it, industry knows it, everyone except for the federal government.
Mr Bowen, just on the detail of the safeguard mechanism, is it the case that it only applies to businesses that it currently applies to, that no new entrants will ever come into the scheme? Is that?
We are not changing the architecture, Phil. Exactly the same architecture as the government has. We are not extending the reach of the safeguards mechanism to any new entities. I know the Business Council suggested that. We've adopted the Business Council recommendation on the baseline, but we feel those entities who are currently covered is the right policy balance.
Just further to that, is it the case that it's the aggregate of all those entities that has to come down to net zero by 2050, not each company?
Yeah, and the Clean Energy Regulator will do a case-by-case analysis of each facility, working with the facility. Every facility is different. Yes, and they already recognise under the government's framework that not every facility will change at exactly the same trajectory. So it will be done facility by facility by the Clean Energy Regulator with the instructions from the government to be consistent with net zero, which, by the way, 2/3 of the facilities are committed to net zero already. So this framework will assist them achieve it.
Phil, hang on. I'm going to give everyone a go. We're going across. I was going to you, but he's jumped in. You're next.
So back on Mark's question, and I don't think you answered it actually, Mr Albanese. I read the document, you're trying to save something like 213 million tonnes from under the safeguard mechanism from the biggest polluters. How does that not translate to higher consumer costs, given that's quite a lot of carbon to be abated? and abating carbon costs?
No, well, that's not right. Because one of the things that businesses know, and the reason why the Business Council has adopted the position they have, an Australian industry group, is that shifting to cleaner energy is shifting to cheaper energy and lowering business costs. Just like when you, if you have solar panels on your house, you've made a decision to invest and spend capital, spend some money, you get a return on that over a short period of time. For the average household, it's about 5 or 6 years. From that point on, you are better off. From that point on, you are in a good position, which is one of the reasons why a range of the policies that we have, the investment vehicles that we've spoken about, are about assisting business through that period, through be it grants or loans, in order to make sure they get that investment so that their costs actually come down, not up. That's why a range of businesses, if you speak to BlueScope Steel, other businesses that are looking at transitioning their energy needs, it's about reducing their costs, not increasing them.
100%. And what was businesses calling for is certainty to assist them on that trajectory. That 9 out of the 10 top emitters, 2/3 of all the facilities covered, are already committed to net zero. They want a stable policy framework. They're begging for a stable policy framework. Their representative peak groups, the BCA and the AIG, who do not come at this with a radical bent, who come at it with a clear and well-considered approach. And as Anthony said, one of the biggest, of course, impulse on the cost of production is energy. Energy costs will come down as a result of renewable energy being unleashed, primarily through the Rewiring the Nation policy, which the modelling finds, and I invite you to go through the modelling. And these aren't Anthony's figures, not my figures, the independent modelling by Australia's preeminent economic, environmental and energy economists.
Mr. Bowen, in the last election you wanted to be the treasurer of this country, so you're familiar with financial books. But to both of you, the $24 billion in public investment, where in the budget does that come from?
Well, that's mainly the Rewiring the Nation Corporation, which will be an off-budget fund in keeping with traditional and accepted bipartisan budget mechanisms like the CEFC and other off-budget funds.
Well, that was announced in my first budget reply. Yep.
Just a technical question. What are you assuming the carbon price will be over the course of your plan? And second one is on, you want to get more people driving EVs in this country. The car makers say our settings are not right in terms of our emission standards. What are you doing about that issue?
Well, Jacob, in terms of the cost of abatement, the baseline in the government's modelling, just like alternative budget accepts the current government's budget as the baseline, this accepts the government's position as the baseline, and then it calculates the impact of Labor's decisions on that, and you get the emissions reduction as a result.
What is that figure?
It's the same figure as in the budget system. It's in the
Government's figure.
Yeah, same as the government's figure.
Which is what?
It's the government's figure.
I think it's $24, isn't it? $24 as you've reported, Jacob, as I recall. That's correct, and that's accepted as the baseline. In relation to electric vehicles, we've obviously worked hard on our electric vehicle policy. Hence, we want Australians to have more choice. We want to reduce the cost of EVs by cutting the taxes. Mr Morrison and Mr Taylor like to talk about taxes. How about they cut the taxes on EVs? We want Australians to have informed choice, hence the real-world testing. Now, the FCAI has introduced a voluntary code. We want to see that work, and we want to let them get on with that on a voluntary basis. We don't feel the need to introduce a mandatory code.
Sorry, just follow on EVs.
No, Catherine, sorry. I'm giving everyone a go if we go.
I've got a couple. You said that the emissions-intensive trade-exposed sector would not face any more onerous measures than their overseas counterparts. But will the ETs also be compensated in the way that they were under the Clean Energy Package or not? That's the first question. Second is, what proportion of your promised abatement is coming from offsets? Is there any proportion of the abatement to 2030 coming from offset? And also,
This is the third.
This is the third. Yeah, the science would say, you know, notwithstanding the fact that you've done some modelling, you've arranged some policies, you've worked out what abatement you can achieve, the climate science would say that the target should be higher than 43% and in fact significantly higher. What's your response to that?
I'll do the first two and the leader's going to do the last one. In relation to, I can't remember what order you asked them in, Catherine, but I'll answer them in the order that they come to mind. In relation to the mix between abatement, direct abatement and offsets, that will be open to the entities to work out their least cost mechanism. The modelling assumes 50% either way. So the modelling assumes that 50% of the abatement will be achieved by direct investment to reduce emissions and 50% will be achieved by buying offsets, which will, of course, re-enliven the carbon market in Australia and the ACCU market, which is a good thing. That creates economic activity as well. But ultimately, that's the, I think, sound assumption that the modellers have made, but ultimately it's up to the facilities as to how they achieve their abatement in line with the Clean Energy Regulator. In terms of compensation, that will be up to the Clean Energy Regulator, but the instruction of the Clean Energy Regulator is that no ET will face a higher carbon constraint than their international competitors. So that will be their primary mechanism. They'll look at the international competition. They'll work cooperatively with the facilities, as they do now. But the problem is the baselines have been set too high, doesn't receive any abatement, and that's why industry are calling out for a better framework, which will provide. On the end figure of 43, as I said, my request to Chris as the Shadow Minister and the economic team was to look at what was a good policy and then get it modelled and get an outcome that was in Australia's interest going forward. We think the difference between what we are putting forward here and the government's position is that if we are successful next year, we'll be able to go to an international climate change conference and not be in the naughty corner. Our figure is pretty consistent with Canada, for example, who have a 2030 target of 40 to 45. Canada's economy is very similar to Australia's. We think that we have got absolutely the balance right, because one of the things that I wanted to make sure is that we have a policy that doesn't leave people behind, that supports industry, that supports jobs, that gets the balance right. This government haven't got the balance right. This government have higher power prices because of their failure to act. They have less jobs because of their failure to act. They've warned about international action, including in trade and other measures, but haven't done anything about it to alleviate that. So this government are very vulnerable going forward, and Australia's in a position as well, whereby going forward they will, I think, not be in a position by next year's Conference of the Parties held at Sharm el-Sheikh to be able to continue to say our target's 26 to 28. But they're not being honest with the Australian people. Like at the last election, they said they were opposed to net zero by 2050. Here, they're not even being honest with themselves. They say they've got a target of 26 to 28, but they'll achieve 30 to 35. But they won't legislate any of it, and they won't really commit to any of it because it's just a vibe. I think that we need to be honest and fair dinkum with the Australian people going forward. You and you.
Yeah, just on the issue of getting the balance of emissions reduction ambition right, independent think tank Climate Works at Melbourne Uni, among others, have forecast that state action alone with their renewable energy targets and EV policies will get the country to around 42% emissions reduction. You've also cast high integration of renewables as a great economic activity, and at the same time you've already today been criticised by green groups for not going hard enough on emissions reduction. Have you been too cautious? Have you been overly cautious, perhaps, not to use that loaded language? Have you been overly cautious in terms of getting the balance right? Could you have gone a bit harder?
We've got the balance right. This is a Labor plan. It's a Labor plan for jobs. It's a Labor plan to cut energy prices.
So you're not going harder than the state's action, though?
I can do with it. You finish on.
Yeah, I do note this about state plans, is that Scott Morrison, I noticed, has been out there criticising our plan without seeing it, but, you know, he just makes things up, so I guess you don't have to look at things in order to make comment on it. The Liberal state governments of New South Wales and South Australia both have 50% targets by 2030, and Tasmania has 100% by 2030. So I suggest you have a chat with Dominic Perrottet. And I also note that today I welcome the fact that the New South Wales government is announcing a renewable energy zone in the Hunter. That's good policy. That's forward-looking. There's one in New England as well that Barnaby Joyce is opposed to. I can't understand why they're opposed to investment and jobs in their own electorates.
Just on the detail of your question, Mike, in relation to state policies as opposed to state targets are already reflected in the government's target, or the government's projection, I should say, is our reading of their modelling. Not their targets, but exactly the actual state policies are already reflected in the government's baseline. So that's not quite, with respect, an accurate reflection of the two models. It's adding in some apples and pears type equations. Those state actions are already included in the government's baseline. What we do is then add to that by the policies, most particularly Rewiring the Nation and Safeguards, which delivers real, quantifiable emissions reduction.
Yeah, on electric vehicles again. Just had a mental blank. Transport emissions is one of the fastest growing sectors in the country. 60% up since 1990. This policy is reducing Nissan Volt by about $2,000. It's only contributing, I think it's 1% overall to the extra reduction in emissions. What's your message to car makers like Volkswagen, who come out and publicly said Australia is missing an opportunity here? We're not sending our EVs to the country until they get the settings right. Why didn't you go further than this?
Car makers are acting. I drove a hydrogen fuel cell Hyundai around Parliament House for laps during the week. I think with Channel 9 to give you the free plug to pay back the footage. What their representative told me was that their latest importation of vehicles here, they sold out every one of the vehicles in hours. There is a massive shift towards replacing diesel vehicles with hydrogen fuel cells and petrol, internal combustion engines, with electric vehicles. We think that lowering the price, particularly the measures that we have on fringe benefits tax that are aimed at the fleet. If you look at Australian vehicles, in Australia about 1/3 of new vehicles, from the figures when I was Transport Minister, it might have changed a little bit, for fleet vehicles. And that's how they enter the market. If you change the price, particularly aimed at that, you really provide a significant incentive. And businesses across the board are doing that. State governments are doing it, the federal government's doing it, and guess what? We'll still have a weekend.
Can I just add to that in terms of, can I just add to that, James, in terms of the detail, everything Anthony said, just to add to, Anthony's right, you mentioned the tariff reduction, you didn't mention the fringe benefits tax abolition on electric vehicles would actually reduce the cost of a car in that range by $9,000, then add that to the tariff reduction, and you've got a very significant reduction. And of course, as Anthony said, the fleet is a very big part. And then after 3 years, on average, the fleets sell their cars, and then it hits the second-hand market. So it will take 3 years or so to flow through to the second-hand market, but that's a very important part of our policy.
Just here.
Thank you. Two questions. First of all, can you please clarify whether your 43% target by 2050 will be something that you're looking to legislate if you win power? And second of all, you've said at length here that, you know, business wants more ambition, and so you're doing what business wants by acting with more ambition. But your 43% target is slightly lower than what was taken by Labor to the 2019 election. And the Business Council of Australia earlier this year called for a 46 to 50% cut by 2030. So why not, if you're really in step with business and if you're really listening to business ambition, why are you kind of going a little bit behind them? Why not match what they're doing? Because on one level you're saying where we're giving business the ambition it wants, but you're not quite getting there in your target.
Well, this is a Labor policy. This is a policy from the alternative government of Australia that's fully costed, that's worked through, that is, I think, has got the right element of ambition. It's a modest policy. We don't pretend that it's a radical policy. It's a consistent policy with our approach. It will do the right thing and the right outcomes on jobs and lowering energy prices, and a part of the suite of measures that we have, so that in our first term, the easy option, some people might have suggested, indeed some people in this room might have suggested to me from time to time, that we just go along with various things that have been announced by the government and not differentiate. We're doing the right thing here. The right thing here, we wanted to make sure that we had the detail, the costing, the plan out there, and it's one that we stand by and will campaign every day between now and the next election, but most importantly, look forward to implementing it.
Yes. Yes, we will legislate net zero by 2050 and the medium-term targets.
What about the 43%
Yes.
target by 2030?
Yes,
You'll
that's,
also
yes,
legislate that?
that's what my yes refers to. Yes.
Here. Give everyone one question first before we...
Thanks, Phil. Just in terms of the number of jobs that you're spruiking here, how many jobs will also be lost from industries that will either be phasing out their work or will have a net negative benefit from this policy?
Well, this is a positive policy. This is a positive policy. In the modelling, very clearly, doesn't, for example, it envisages that there'll be no bring forward of any closures, for example. None. This policy will not have an impact on that. This is a positive policy to create jobs.
Absolutely. And you know, the thing is that Australia will need more electricity, not less. As we electrify our vehicles, electrify everything, we need more electricity, not less. All the assumptions and all the conclusions in the modelling shows that job impact, and as Anthony says, no bring forward of coal-fired power closures, for example, as a result of any of these policies.
Yep.
Mr Albanese, rightly or wrongly, a lot of the debate after this will be about the 43% number. Now, Mr Morrison has said today that that number is not safe for the Hunter, it's not safe for Gladstone, it's not safe for jobs. I mean, I'm sure he's not saying the word Hunter just as a coincidence. What makes you think that that figure won't be too high in seats in regional Queensland, regional New South Wales, but also seen as not ambitious enough in inner city seats such as Macnamara or Griffith?
Well, he said that net zero by 2050 would have a devastating impact on the economy before he then supported it. This is a guy who said that electric vehicles would end the weekend before he denied saying that and pretended that he supported it. This is a guy who just attacks anything, is negative, and I think that one of the big distinctions at the next election will be a tired government that is out of puff. We saw yesterday a government that lost the Education Minister and Health Minister on one day during a pandemic. We see another retirement from government ranks this morning in Damien Drum. We see a government that doesn't have a plan for today, let alone any concept of a vision for tomorrow. I think that the first step towards creating a better future is being able to imagine one, being able to set in place then concrete plans to do so. Scott Morrison wants to be elected and have a second decade in office based upon just negative plans. He stood up a few weeks ago before Glasgow, just in the days beforehand, they did a press conference. They didn't release modelling. They just released kind of a vibe. They now stand in the parliament and give speeches about how legislation is bad. I think that this is a government that don't deserve a second term in office. This is just one of the policy announcements that we'll be making coming days. Those people who've been here for this term know that I said, outlined at the beginning of my leadership, what the plan would be. The 4 stages. We're now in the 4th quarter. The wind's at our back. We'll have this today. We'll have a major campaign rally on Sunday. More to come. Watch this space. but we'll be putting forward a positive, optimistic view of Australia's future.
Just on the question of fuel standards, surely if you had a more aggressive approach to fuel standards, you would get a quicker transformation in the transport area. Have you shied away from that because of a fear of a public backlash, or do you have some better rationale for that?
So, vehicle emission standards, the government does have a policy on fuel standards we support, which they announced in the last budget. Vehicle emission standards. As I said, we've looked closely at all the options. We've consulted widely, as you'd expect any opposition to do, including with the manufacturers. I note the manufacturers' voluntary code. We want to see that work. We want to work with manufacturers for their voluntary code to work. But we want to keep it voluntary. Well, because we believe that's the right model for now. Give it a chance to work. We'll reduce the cost of EVs by the tax cut, and we will work proactively to see the EV take-up increased by our EV tax cut for private fleets, by buying 75% of the Commonwealth fleet being new electric vehicles by 2025. These are all big and important policy levers. And can I just add, in relation to the question before about the government scare campaign, if I could be indulgent, yeah, Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison have already made comments today before they've seen a policy, which shows just how standard their behaviour is. Josh Frydenberg said this morning, our Labor never models or cost their policies. I mean, au contraire. I mean, he said that before he saw the document. And Scott Morrison said this policy will put electricity prices up. Before, he must have been aware of modelling which shows it puts electricity prices down. These guys are liars, and they'll continue to lie. We're up for a good, strong debate about Australia's future.
Mr. Bowen, you talked before about, I think you were talking about you've taken some of the government's assumptions and built on them. And then in the government's modelling, it had that sort of magic sauce, the secret sauce being the 15% that would get us to 35%. Are you accepting that one, that assumption? And asking the same question a different way, is there any assumption about technological change that underpins your 43%?
Well, the difference is we have accepted the government, as you would expect.
So you accepted the secret sauce?
Andrew, if I could just answer the question you just asked with respect. Of course, the modellers, when we say we didn't do the modelling, our independent modellers, Reputex, took the government's modelling as the baseline and then worked out what would change as a result of our policies. And they worked out, for example, that our safeguards mechanism would encourage firms to adopt new technology. Now, we accept it. We've always accepted. We've never said to the contrary that new technology won't play a very important role in getting to net zero. What we just don't think is it'll just sort of happen without a policy framework, like the safeguards mechanism change, to encourage and work with industry to adopt that new technology. That's the difference. You know, a more minor policy we're announcing today, we haven't mentioned because it's just one of the suite of policies, is a modest $8 million investment in the development of the Asparagopsis seaweed, for example, to help reduce methane emissions. That's technology. That's technology, but it'll require investment. You can't magic it up. You can't assume it'll happen. Of course technology's got a role to play, particularly in the out years, but you need the policy framework to deliver it. That's what's different. Anthony Albanese, as Prime Minister, will preside over a policy framework to deliver it. Scott Morrison, as Prime Minister, hopes it'll conjure up.
Hey, you can have one more between you, Finn.
I've got a double banger then.
You get one.
Okay. Look,
There are limited planes back to Sydney.
in your first headland speech, you made a point. You said you had to broaden Labor's message.
Headland speech was the other guy.
Whatever you call it. Was it?
Big speech.
Yeah, your father's speech. The one you did when you first became leader.
Vision
You
statement.
said the aim was to broaden Labor's pitch on climate policy beyond the environment
Yeah,
to the economy and
absolutely.
jobs. Is the
Thank
emphasis of this policy more on the economy and jobs now than the environment, or the other way around?
Well, it's about, can I make this point? If people didn't believe in climate change, and there's a few on the other side in the government ranks, using clean energy is still smart policy because it drives down costs. It lifts productivity and it boosts the economy and it creates jobs. I make that point. It's a point I made when I was the climate change spokesperson for the Labor Party under Kim Beazley's leadership, when we developed a whole suite of policies. But there's been a substantial change since then. Then you had to send a signal to the market about renewables because you needed to increase the volume of them to decrease the price. Now, government just needs to get out of the way in terms of not having 20 different policies which create a handbrake on investment, because business knows that the cheapest form of new energy is renewables. So that's one of the differences. But we also have a range of other things to say, and it is there outlined in our policy documents. We see climate change as a national security issue. We think that one of the ways in which we engage in the Indo-Pacific and with our neighbours and in the globe is by having a credible climate change policy. Now, if you ask people in the US administration at the moment, for example, about Australia's position, the truth is they're scathing of it, because Australia is sitting back one of the few countries that at Glasgow refused to increase any of its ambition going forward, which is what it was about. So we also do see it as a part of our international policy. That's why we've committed to making a bid to host the next COP that's available in 3 years' time. And that's why I think that this is a policy that will fit as well with the overall approach that we have to secure work, to jobs and going forward.
You highlighted the problem. What you said was
will have to be the last one.
Okay, you highlighted what you said was the Prime Minister's contradictions and his positions on this. But can I go back to my original question and perhaps get an answer? If you referred to the 45% reduction of the last election as a mistake and too ambitious, how can you refer to this 43% as modest?
No, I referred to the policy. We didn't win the election. We didn't win the election. What you've got to do when you aren't successful isn't to do the same thing and expect a different outcome. What you need to do is to examine the lessons which are there. We did that. We did that, and I stood up at the National Press Club and outlined, when we released transparently the first stage of our four-stage plan was review. Before, then we did the vision statements, second. Then we did the platform through our national conference. Now we're doing the policy. And one of the lessons, if you go back and have a look at the Weatherall-Emerson review, was that there was difficulty answering some of the questions of cost and economic impact. The Labor Party has commissioned this. We went to an independent, the most serious body that we could find. It's at a substantial cost, have modelled it. It is more substantial than any policy analysis in terms of economic costing than any policy that has been released in any area by any opposition at any level of government in Australia. That's the lesson. That's the lesson. That's why this is right, this policy. We didn't pick a figure and then not be able to explain how we can get there. What we've done is outline a series of policies, and you can see how much they contribute to the reduction in emissions going forward. Thanks very much.